start with that.
New York's Adirondack Park is bigger than Yellowstone, Yosemite, Glacier, Grand Canyon, and Great Smokies National Parks combined. It is one of the largest unbroken deciduous forests on Earth. It has 1,000 miles of wild and scenic rivers and hundreds of breathtaking lakes and peaks. But here's an even more amazing thing about the Adirondack Park. Most of its land is privately owned. And 85 million people live within a day's drive. Yet the Adirondacks seem almost completely undeveloped. How did that happen?
In the story of land use planning in the United States, the Adirondack Park Agency is
cause.
he believed in big things. He was not a small man in any sense of the word. It wouldn't have happened without him. There's no question about it.
Rockefeller strong-armed state lawmakers into passing the bill that created the Adirondack Park Agency. He ordered the agency to write 2 master plans for a territory the size of the state of Vermont and to deliver them in less than 2 years. Nothing like that had ever been done before. The APA's young staff was brilliant, passionate about protecting the park, and extremely hardworking. The plans they produced were revolutionary, and 50 years later, their work is still praised and studied. Today, the urgent need to control climate change depends on preserving and restoring large forests. New York did that in a big way 50 years ago.
It's the most unusual case of land protection in the country because it's also an attempt at community protection. The Adirondacks is trying something very hard. We're trying to have wild nature and human beings make their living in more or less the same place. The wilderness and the hamlets are intertwined in a way that you see in almost no other landscape on the planet. And that's what makes it exciting, and it's also what makes it difficult.
The wide open spaces of the Adirondacks are now recognized as one of Earth's treasures, but a lot of people still disagree. They say that the agency and its restrictions on private land development are un-American. They believe that private property is private, and that the Adirondacks don't need more wilderness as much as it needs better jobs.
60% of that land is privately owned. No privately owned land is part of a state park. They have taken the theory that Kepler practiced. If you tell a lie often enough, you will soon become believed. It will be a fact.
It's an endless debate that boils down to a basic question. What is wild land worth?
Next time they're going to see with your rifles, but they've got to have another thought about this. Because we are deadly serious about defending our rights in here.
Okay, so now I've got a little bit of a talk before Kevin starts lobbing questions at me. And we've got some slides to throw on the screen while I'm talking. The first one, the book was published about a year ago, and I made the PBS documentary that you just saw the clip from, and that's available on YouTube. You can go to my site, awildidea.com, to watch the whole thing if you like. The book stops with the signing of the law in 1973, the land use regulation plan. But the story does not stop there. And now I'm working on volume 2, which is sort of telling 2 concurrent stories. One is how the wilderness protection movement became a profession, and the other is how opposition to wilderness protection became a political force all at the same time. So next slide. You can see this is really a story about a map. And we're going to show a little blow up of the map here. Every color on this map corresponds to different rules about what you can and can't do on that particular piece of land. And usually zoning and land use planning are considered really boring topics. But this story is really pretty dramatic for a couple of reasons. One is that this map and this plan really were kind of unprecedented for their time. It was the first time that people really started the concept of carrying capacity, how much development could a piece of territory handle. The first time that was translated into land use planning. And the second reason why this is a dramatic story is that this was a huge imposition of state power on a rural area. And the rural people didn't like it at all. So next slide will show you an old picture of three guys camping. And this picture was taken in 1960. I'm skipping over a part of the book that sort of talks about a 17-year prehistory of the Adirondack Park Agency law. But the book goes into it because I wanted to show how social changes, big social changes happen. And what happened in the Adirondacks also happened in the civil rights movement, the women's movement, any other big shift in social values, is that a very small group of people worked very hard for a long time in obscurity to advance a certain idea. And then at some point, society caught up with them and it went mainstream. And the guys in the picture, the guy on the left is Clarence Petty, who is a New York State forest ranger. The guy in the middle is his partner, Neil Stout. And the guy on the right is a New York State assemblyman named Watson Pomeroy. And Watson Pomeroy was the chairman of a legislative committee that was measuring the potential for areas of the Adirondacks to become wilderness areas. Clarence and Neil were actually doing the measuring. And they brought Watson along on their camping trips because he really wasn't an environmentalist, and they kind of were. And they turned him into a rabid protector of Adirondack wilderness by taking him along on these weekend camping trips. Now you can skip over the next slide and go to the architectural rendering. And that, I think you can do that too. Here's the key figure, as you saw in the preview, was Governor Nelson Rockefeller. He was probably the most powerful governor in the history of New York. He was governor for 14 years. And he was faced in the 1960s with a growing public realization that the Adirondacks were in crisis because there were plans for second home vacation developments all over that were on the books. And the people who were wilderness protection advocates really did not want those big vacation home developments to happen. And the environmental movement was kind of blowing up. And Rockefeller, who was a very astute politician, understood that a bold plan to protect the Adirondacks would be a political plus for him. But Rockefeller also liked big, bold plans. This picture shows downtown Albany, where he leveled 98 acres of an urban area. He purchased and leveled 98 downtown acres to build the Empire State Plaza. So he liked to do things big, he liked to do things flashy, and that's the spirit that he brought to a commission that he appointed to study problems in the Adirondacks and recommend solutions. Okay, next slide. So this is 1967, and the Adirondacks are under pressure because this superhighway just opened up the east side of the park. This is what people call the Northway, Interstate 87, connects Albany to Montreal. It was new, it was flashy. 1967, the idea that you could drive 160 miles with no stoplights was just unheard of. And people were afraid that that was going to make it so much easier to get from New York and Philadelphia and Boston to the Adirondacks that people were going to buy up all the private land, put vacation homes all over the place, and ruin the wide open wilderness character of the park. But there was another thing going on here too. In the 1960s, the whole idea of national parks was to get people close to scenic wonders in their cars. And the Adirondacks has something called the Forever Wild Clause, which prevents any development in the state-owned forest preserve. And Rockefeller appointed a commission to study the Adirondacks. There were people on the commission who really wanted to get rid of the Forever Wild Clause so that they could build causeways and parking lots and beaches and hotels and snack bars near the marquee lakes and peaks of the Adirondacks, in the spirit of the interstate highway system. So next slide shows you the members of the commission. This slide was shown in the video clip, but just wanted to zero in on this part of the slide, the upper right hand. The most important guy on the commission was the guy in the extreme right of the picture, wearing the three-piece suit, a guy named Harold Jerry. He was not a commissioner. He was the director of the staff, and he was a hardcore Forever Wild guy. He didn't want any building in the backcountry at all. And he made sure that everybody he hired on the staff agreed with him. The most important person he hired was the young man with his eyes closed, George Davis, who was a 28-year-old graduate student who had just enrolled at Cornell University's Natural Resources program and was only there for one semester before Jerry plucked him out and paid him 4 times as much to study the same problem that he was studying at Cornell, which is how do you get nature and people to thrive in the same environment? How can people work and play in a place without degrading the natural environment around them? George Davis kind of led the fight, led the campaign really, to produce the private land plan. Next slide. The commission had a pretty vigorous debate between the national park people and the Forever Wild people. And the Forever Wild people basically won on the commission. And they appointed this guy to be the chairman of the commission, a guy named Harold Hochschild. Harold Hochschild owned one of the Adirondack grape camps in Blue Mountain Lake. And he loved the Adirondacks so much that he was the founder of the Adirondack Experience Museum in Blue Mountain Lake. Harold Hochschild was also an international business executive. He owned a global mining conglomerate. He was old enough that he remembered when Nelson Rockefeller was wearing shorts as a boy. He was one of the very few people in New York State who Nelson Rockefeller could not intimidate. And so Harold Hochschild very skillfully maneuvered this commission toward making some very, very bold, groundbreaking recommendations. And then he very skillfully maneuvered those recommendations through the legislative process. And the one recommendation that was turned into law in 1971 was the creation of an agency that would draw up 2 master plans, one for the public land in the Adirondack Park, the Forest Preserve, the Forever Wild Land, and one for the private land, which takes up 60% of the territory of the park. Next slide. Harold Hochschild hated commercial development. He really couldn't have disagreed more with the national park idea. And he actually put up a photo show in the Adirondack Museum in 1966, I think, showing pictures like this one. This is Lake George Village in 1966, showing pictures like this one to show what the Adirondacks were turning into. There was a sense of crisis. There was a sense that the whole park could end up looking like Lake George. I showed this slide in Lake George last week, and the people in Lake George said, "What's the problem? This is fine." And a lot of the people who lived in the Adirondack Park thought there's nothing wrong with this. But Harold Hochschild and the Forever Wild people, most of whom were from urban areas or suburban areas, they didn't want their Adirondacks to look like this. And so the recommendations that they came up with had a vision of the park that was wide open and appeared to be a wilderness, even though the Adirondacks is an intensively studied area that was thoroughly logged over in the 19th century. They wanted it to feel like a wilderness. Next slide. So the other thing that Harold Hochschild had going for him was the time. When the commission was working in 1970, that was the very first Earth Day. And the very first Earth Day was this explosion of public concern about the environment. 20 million people all over the United States did these grassroots demonstrations and kind of upbeat kind of events. You know, some of you will remember, because suddenly Americans had become convinced that the planet was being suffocated by pollution and overcrowding. And politicians were sort of baffled by this very sudden upwelling of concern. They did anything they could to get out in front of it and appear to be in favor of environmental protection. And this is Earth Day 1970, the first Earth Day. Nelson Rockefeller did two things. He created the Department of Environmental Conservation on this day, but he also got on what he called a non-polluting vehicle, which is a Schwinn 3-speed. And he rode it down a street in Albany. And you know, one of the reasons I'm very proud to be a journalist is that we do things like this picture where if you look closely, it's clear that the governor is riding the wrong way on a one-way street. Next slide. So this is the report that was released at the beginning of 1971 that recommended this state agency that would draft these two master plans. And skillfully it was passed, but also because environmental concern was just overwhelming in 1971, and very few legislators were prepared to vote against something like this in 1971. Now you can skip the blank slide and go to the next one. And so the Adirondack Park Agency was created in 1971. George Davis was the very first employee. You can see him on the left. Clarence Petty was lured out of retirement to be the sort of wise man of the natural areas. He's in the middle with his arms crossed. He's very happy to be lured out of retirement because he retired from the state and went to Alaska and pretty quickly got bored. And George, who had become his friend by then, sort of lured him back into state employment. And this group put the plan together in a year, which was really quite a remarkable thing. This is when the book really gets to be quite wild, is they had to create this plan for 6 million acres in a year. And they didn't have very much money. They had really crappy vehicles, and they had to ground truth all of the data for the park by driving on every road and looking in detail at what was going on around them. So it was an enormous amount of work. They worked around the clock pretty much for a year to do it. A lot of crazy stories about that time. And they finally produced the plan, which we'll go back to, and I'll show you this map on the next slide. This is the this is Lake George, is the big lake on the right, in the southeastern corner of the park. So the light green and the sort of moss green are public lands. That's the forever wildland. The dark green, sort of the darkish yellowish green, that's a land category called resource management, where you're allowed to put one building on every 43.5 acres. The yellow category is called rural use, and you're allowed to put one building on every 8.5 acres. And those two categories, resource management and rural use, claim 85% of the privately owned land in the Adirondack Park. The idea behind the plan was to keep the backcountry undeveloped. Harold Jerry's idea that there wasn't going to be any new development. There wasn't going to be any big new cities or vacation homes in the backcountry, and to steer construction and development toward the existing centers. Like you can see, Lake George Village at the base of Lake George allows greater development. Sacandaga Lake along the lakeshore allows greater development, and so forth, the darker colors. So this was pretty strict. This was actually much stricter than any other land use plan that was adopted in the United States. It was very popular statewide. New Yorkers in general supported it, but within the Adirondack Park, it was kind of like throwing a lit match into a puddle of gasoline. And the last slide kind of gives you a sense of what happened up in the park after the land passed. This was an ad that ran in a real estate magazine in the mid 1970s. And these are guys who these guys are actually in their work clothes because they work at a tourist attraction called Frontier Town outside of Warrensburg. But they're making the point here that no matter what those bureaucrats in Albany say, this is our land and we're going to defend it with our fists and our rifles. And that's kind of what I'm writing about now. That's what volume 2 is about. Maybe in a couple of years, I'll come back and tell you about that book. So that's the prepared stuff I have, but I'm really excited that I've lured Kevin here because he's spent so much of his life in the Adirondack Park and loves the Adirondack Park. As and you know, Kevin, you're the person the Adirondack Park was created for. The open space character of it was saved so that people like you and I could go and enjoy it. And so I'm very glad that you're here.
Well, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure. I've thoroughly enjoyed the book. And as you know, as we've discussed, I love the Adirondacks. And it kind of struck me when you said that they took along that one gentleman who had never really been in the wilderness. And once he got in there, it was like, wow. And I kind of had that experience. I never was an outdoor type person. And my parents were, you know, roughing it was the, you know, a Holiday Inn kind of deal. So as summer of my graduation from high school, did my first backpacking trip up into the Adirondacks, and my very first peak was Mount Haystack. And we didn't really know what we were doing, but I got above timberline and I was like, man, this is New York State. I can't believe how beautiful it is. I could just see forever. You could see Vermont and Canada.
And how big.
And just how massive, and it was wonderful. And for me, that, like that other gentleman there, kind of set the hook of this is important space. And as I got to know more about it, I realized how massive it was. 6 million acres is hard to wrap your head around. It's the size of Vermont. And I guess what about 2.6 million of it is state-owned kind of thing. So
Forever
definitely
Wild.
Forever Wild. And then the other part still is extremely well managed and still beautiful. And I have been back and forth to the Adirondacks so many times. It's my touchstone. I've been lucky. I've been on all 7 continents to go to some of the world's greatest mountains in the world. But I keep coming back to the Adirondacks. My wife loves it. And I kind of, when you asked me a little bit about the Adirondacks, I kind of looked it up. Yeah, I'm a 2-time 46er. But there's certain ones in the 46 that I've been up 5 times, 4 times, a whole lot. I try to figure out, and beyond just the 46, other peaks there, I think it's something like about 145 summits that I've done up in the Adirondacks.
Wow.
I keep going back. I was back there late this past May with some friends and went up Algonquin, Iroquois, and Wright. And I've done those multiple times, but it's become this wonderful area that I love. My wife loves it. It's one of our special happy places. One of my best Christmas presents ever was I made one of those books you can make online, and it was all about Adirondack memories and cross-country skiing and hiking and all those kinds of great things. So
Yeah.
so I'm a huge fan of the Adirondacks now, and I know you got involved, you know, so what got you excited about the Adirondacks and to do a project of this magnitude?
Well, I had a similar experience to yours when I was in my teens. I went with a Boy Scout troop and went 100 miles canoe trip on the Racket River and had never seen anything like remotely like that before. And I obviously never recovered from that experience. The getting involved with the book was a different story. I'm a career journalist, and I've been self-employed for 25 years. And I was a friend who happened to be the program officer of a foundation and who had been involved as an environmentalist in the creation of the Adirondack Park as a lobbyist. he asked me if I would be willing to go up and do oral history interviews with some of the people who had created the agency, because they were getting on in years and they were too busy to write their memoirs. And, you know, he was afraid they were going to die and all the stories were going to be lost. And I just wanted to get my expenses paid to go camping. So I said, sure, whatever. And that was 20 years ago. And the first person I interviewed was Clarence Petty, because he was the oldest. He was 98 when I met him, but he was still spot on, great storyteller. And by the time I finished talking, I made 12 hours of tape with Clarence. By the time I was finished with him, I was completely hooked on the story. So I kept collecting material for this oral history project. I collected about 1,500 pages of transcripts, interviewed about 60 people. And then the grant ran out, and as I said, I'm self-employed, so I had to make a living. And I put all that material in a filing cabinet for a decade, where it taunted me as I was working on my other things. Finally, I got to the point where I could choose the project on my own. And I figured I'd better do this as a book before I got too old to do it. So I wrote the book in time for the 50th anniversary of the APA, which happened this last year up to the next year was the 50th anniversary of this plan. So that's sort of a long story, but like you, Kevin, I mean, wouldn't you be up there right now if you could be?
Well, my wife and I say, I mean, it really is our happy place. Our blood pressure and heart rate drops a little bit when we get up there. And yeah, for me, just a long history. So I have to ask you though, with so many of those stories and interviews that you had, and knowing that, you know, my birthday is actually Earth Day, not the original Earth Day. I'm older than that, but it's April 22nd. But I do know that environmental movement was a really big deal at that point. And, you know, not everyone though was as excited like the locals. So with some of your interviews with folks, were there some locals who were like, oh yeah, this was terrible? And
absolutely.
Did you, I mean, so you had some not negative experiences with you necessarily,
absolutely.
But what did they have to say about the Rockefellers and all those other folks who weren't from the North Country?
Yeah,
telling them how to run the show.
Flatlanders.
Flatland,
Yeah.
okay.
So yeah, that was what kept me interested actually, is you know, I did what I was assigned to do and talk to the people who set up the agency. But as I learned more about the story, I started getting more interested in the local people. And because in many ways, I felt like the local people had valid concerns. Value had been taken away from them without compensation. They were justified in their anger, and they really had been kind of, you know, they had kind of been pushed around and steamrolled a little bit. And so I did talk to them, and you know, the local people ran the gamut. The local people of that generation ran the gamut from housing developers who were angry because they were going to lose money, to people who didn't really own property in the Adirondacks, aside from maybe they owned their own homes. But they just kind of felt insulted. And what really drove the opposition was not so much economic loss. It was the idea that this is our territory. These are our towns. This is our home territory. And people from Albany and big cities, environmentalists from urban areas and state bureaucrats from Albany are telling us how we're going to live on it. And that turned out to be a very powerful motivator for people. And one of the things that kept me interested in the story was it went national. You know, in the 80s, that spirit started blowing up in the western part of the United States. And that sort of reflexive idea that the government's not going to tell me what to do is kind of what's tearing the country to pieces right now. And in the Adirondacks, it was happening in the early 70s.
Well, one of the things I really liked about the book is, you know, if you lay it out, it's like, well, this development of this amazingly large park does sound kind of dry, but it was really good. It reads like fiction in some places because the cast of characters in there, I felt like I was in some of the boardrooms and the community meetings where people are yelling and it's going late and all that kind of stuff. So I really enjoyed that aspect of it. It was really quite lively for what might not be, considered
Zoning.
Yeah, zoning.
It's a book about
basically
zoning.
about zoning the size of Vermont.
Don't tell anybody.
So,
It's
no,
about
great.
zoning. Yeah, no, I appreciate that very much. And I kind of have spent a career as a journalist writing long, detailed pieces about subjects that are ordinarily thought of as being very dull. And I've taken a lot of abuse for that. But what I've found over the years is that the reason I write about these subjects is that they're incredibly important. And they don't get enough attention because they're considered to be dull, but if you focus on the individuals in the story and you turn those individuals into characters and you develop, without bending the facts, you develop storylines and arcs for them. You can make certain stories dramatic. And I spent so much time and effort on this one because I really saw an opportunity to do that, to write a factual account of what happened that would be very dramatic and engaging, but would also teach people about the politics of land use.
So one of the things that I found really interesting in it was they're putting all this big plan together and they're at the 11th hour and they have to submit it. And I don't know how many pages it is. And all this work that's going into it is going to become the law of the land. And there's no real computers or, it was typewritten, I imagine, right? And some drawn by hand in the map areas and those white, right? So the fellow who's going to deliver it has it in his briefcase.
There's one copy.
And there's only one other copy because someone insisted to make a copy, and which was long and tedious at that point. It wasn't like this zip, 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 zip kind of thing. So there was one copy. So what happened to the original plan and the guy with the guy's briefcase that was inside his briefcase?
Yeah, thanks. Well, he lost it. One of the things that was kind of necessary in this story was to explain to people who are under the age of 60 that in the early 1970s, people drank like fish.
Correct.
And they smoked like chimneys. And the other thing about the Adirondack Park Agency crew is they were all really young. They were at the beginnings of their careers in the 70s. And so Bill Kissel, who's a lovely guy, lives in Lake Placid, still a practicing attorney. He had this one copy that it was the most recent copy with all of the last minute changes written in of the plan. And he drove it down to Albany to deliver it to the legislature. He went to an office in Albany and gave it to the guy who actually wrote the law, Richard Persico, who was a state official. And they said, wow, that's great. We're finally finished. Let's go out for a drink. And Persico said, yeah, that's a great idea. Before we go, let's make a photocopy. And Kissel said, do we really have to? Because at that time, photocopy machines were very slow. So it took about a half an hour to photocopy this. And then Kissel put the original back in his briefcase and went to a bar on Lark Street in Albany and got hammered and lost his briefcase. And luckily, Persico had made the copy.
Had there been no copy, would there be no law or what? I mean, it's close. I mean, I'm sure they would have come up with something, but.
Had there been no copy, there would have been intense embarrassment. And it's possible that there wouldn't have been a law because it was really late in the legislative session and it was not for sure that it was going to happen. And one of the things that I learned in writing this book is when you're pushing a bill through the New York State legislature, whether it passes or not often depends on really random factors. And this could have made the difference. I mean, you can't say one way or the other, but it would have been a setback. It would have set them back a couple of days.
Another thing I know we mentioned is that back in those days, there were lots of disagreements. People were disagreeable, but they couldn't be jerks to each other because they were small towns in
Right.
some ways. So they had to kind of get along.
Yeah.
And so they could disagree. I mean, they might be a little disagreeable, but for the most part, they weren't that disagreeable. So if you flash back flash forward 50 years, if we're trying to do this, you know, the Forever Wild thing is in the works, but it's not, you know, not fleshed out at this point. In today's climate, which is so polarized and there's tribalism,
Yeah.
how do you think, would this ever get done, do you think? Or are there battles going on now?
You know, I think I think there's no way it could happen again the way it happened in 71. But on another level, it kind of has to happen again. In 71, there were 3 television networks. There were just a small number of daily newspapers.
Mhm.
There was no internet, and there were not media bubbles where you could only consume political points of view that you agreed with. So that polarization that's driven by media hadn't really started. And then, as you mentioned, in the Adirondacks themselves, you know, if you live in a small town, as I do, I live in Ithaca, you learn pretty quickly that being a jerk to somebody is very expensive because you're going to see that person again in some other context, and you might have to rely on them, particularly in a very harsh climate where maybe your car doesn't start or maybe you need firewood. So people in the Adirondacks, they would disagree vehemently and violently with each other, and they would get into fights with each other. But they always knew that they had to rely on each other. And that was another aspect of this that was kind of inspiring and kind of sad too, is the degree to which people who had fundamental disagreements could be friends. There's story after story about that. That still happens, but it's much more difficult now. The reason I said it has to happen again is that large unbroken forests are the most effective and the cheapest way to control CO2 in the atmosphere. And we really have to start doing a better job of protecting and expanding these carbon sinks as we manage climate change. So, you know, there are now environmental organizations all over the globe that are making what they call landscape level deals. And they've learned, I think, from the mistakes that the Adirondack Park Agency made in not taking local people's opinions into account. But it's a very delicate balance, as Bill McKibben said at the beginning of the clip, trying to keep nature and people doing business in the same place is very difficult. We got to figure it out.
Right. Yeah. And like I mentioned with you earlier, I had a friend who was in Star Lake, and just the economics of getting by in the rural North Country was very typical for folks. You know, like the father would work 2 or 3 jobs, mom
Yeah.
might have a couple of jobs just to get by, because there weren't reliable
Correct.
industry like in Rochester back in 50 years ago. It was Mother Kodak, and it was easy to get a job or Xerox or that kind of stuff. But people had to be pretty self-reliant and figure it out to make sure to scrape out a living. That was.
And back then in the western part of the Adirondacks, Star Lake, very few people made a living off of tourism.
Yeah.
It was logging, it was mining.
Yeah, there was a mine somewhere near that had shut down.
A paper mill.
Yeah.
And that was where you worked. And so the idea of putting on these very severe land restrictions to protect tourism was seemed crazy for that part of the world at that time. So, yeah, I actually had a question for you, Kevin.
Sure.
And I wish we had another hour so that I could really go into this book. It's quite good. It's written with Gary.
Gary Fallison.
Yeah, Gary Fallison, well-known Rochester writer. And it goes into a fair amount of detail about how you climbed Mount Everest, how you attempted it without summiting once and then went back and summited the second time. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Thank you.
And you've also been through, been to the highest points on all 7 continents. So you obviously don't mind traveling. And you could be spending your time probably in any mountain range in North America, maybe in any mountain range of the world. You've seen a lot of the greatest mountain ranges in the world. Why do you keep going to the Adirondacks?
That's a good question, but I think there certainly is proximity. So it's a little bit easier to get to. It's still not, you can't just go up. I'm going to go up right now. It's 5 hours to the high peaks. But I love all those other mountains. It's a little bit like your first time doing something that's amazing. Your first love, so my first mountain was up there. And that was one of the times that I was just sort of came alive in the backcountry, and being above timberline was just sensational for me. And maybe I'm a sucker, and for the, first time kind of thing, but I've gone back there so many times and it never seems to disappoint. I introduced the high peaks to my wife, or my wife to be at the time, and she became a 46er. She didn't know it at the time, but she really loved it and fell in love with the high peaks. So that's it. It's hard to explain. I mean, are there prettier, more majestic, more massive mountains? Yeah, but there's a certain charm and something that just I'm enthralled with the Adirondacks, and it's big too. I mean, the whole area itself. I mean, we were just in Zion National Park and Bryce National Park, and they're great. I mean, stunning, majestic, awesome. Adirondacks is so much bigger, and I don't know, it just has a piece of my heart.
Yeah, it's the largest.
I don't know that I can explain it that well, but it was my first.
I think you've come pretty close. One of the people I interviewed, Gary Randorf, who was in addition to other things, was a pretty advanced landscape photographer up there. He said something that stuck with me about the Adirondacks, which was that other mountain ranges will give you these vast vistas, but the beauty of the Adirondacks is in close-ups.
Mm-hmm.
It's in like the way the water reflects off a pond, or a plant by the trail, or light through the trees, or sort of
the smell of the pines.
Close-up things rather than, but you can go above timberline and see long distances. Mm-hmm. And get that expansive sort of Sound of Music feeling. Mm-hmm. But when you're in the woods, you see a different kind of beauty.
Right. Yeah, there's some brooks, and it's on real hot summer days that you cool down in a little bit.
Yeah, and
there's beautiful flowing little, babbling brooks, or with little pools and little waterfalls. Some are big waterfalls too.
And it has it's proven to reduce your blood pressure for sure.
I think so.
So I would, in addition to my book, which I hope you would take a look at, this is called Mount Everest: Confessions of an Amateur Peak Bagger. You can get it on Amazon, and it's well worth the read. And I think we've probably come pretty close to an hour, haven't we?
Yeah. You mentioned the part 2 of this book or project. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I kind of skipped over it, but I'm glad you asked. I am up there now. You climb mountains, I go and interview old people, which is another kind of pleasure. But what I'm writing about now is 2 things that are happening at the same time, starting after the law is signed in the 1970s. One thing that happens is the land protection movement becomes a profession. These small volunteer organizations like the Adirondack Mountain Club, the Sierra Club, the Nature Conservancy, and a few others because of the mainstreaming of the environmental movement, they start to become professionally managed nonprofit organizations with significant revenue streams. And they begin to manage their donor bases and grow their donor bases. They discover direct mail. So they get staffed and they start to run more like professional businesses. And so that's one of the things that I'm writing about. A lot of good comes out of that and some bad comes out of that too. Concurrently with that, with the professionalization of the environmental movement, comes the backlash to the environmental movement. And as I said earlier, what happened in the Adirondacks is sort of a preview for what happened nationally. And so I think it's worth going into it in some detail, both because they're dramatic stories, but also because it kind of gives you a sense of why people who are so vehemently anti-government feel that way. What's at the root of their dissatisfaction? So that's kind of what I'm trying to do in volume 2. Thanks for asking.
So you said some of the good and bad of the environmental organizations going more mainstream and managed professionally. What's some of the bad that comes up?
Well, you know, that's a great question. One of the things that's happened, which is kind of disappointing to me, is that because environmental organizations are dependent on their donors and their members, dues-paying members, they don't really share very well with each other. And so there have been points in the history of the environmental movement internationally, but also in the Adirondacks, where organizations that should be working together do not work together, basically for business reasons, for competitive reasons.
Okay.
And that reduces their effectiveness because they're not acting so much as agents advancing a political cause, but as professionals who are trying to protect their offices.
Gotcha.
So that's one of the bad things. But, you know, on balance, it's been a very good thing for the Adirondacks because in the 70s, the era that I wrote A Wild Idea about, there really wasn't any nonprofit sector in the Adirondacks at all. And now, after government employment, nonprofit groups are one of the largest employers in the park. So there's now a pretty big constituency for wilderness protection living inside of the Adirondack Park because of these groups.
Mm-hmm.
So, so yeah, it's a mix.
Just this kind of an aside that when the environmental movement was really kind of getting going in the early 70s, you know, and I think you mentioned the commercial with the famous Tira on the Indian, the crying Indian. And I do recall that, and probably anyone under 60 doesn't recall as much, but litter used to be a huge issue in this country. And even I think when I first started going to the Adirondacks, there were campsites that were sometimes people would just leave some rubbish,
Yeah.
you know, just, I mean, in the really pristine areas,
Yeah.
which should be pristine areas, you almost never, ever see any of that, at least in the high peaks. And even if someone drops like, you know, a candy wrapper or some kind of thing like that, someone picks it up. I mean, it's pretty amazing. And
it's a cultural change.
A huge cultural change in being fortunate enough to travel around the world. I noticed on Kilimanjaro, although not on the second trip that I was on there, but on the first one, there were a lot more rubbish. And on one trip that I went to in Indonesia, going to Karsten's Pyramid in Papua New Guinea, we did a shakedown hike that was a couple hours outside of Jakarta. You know, it's a big city, a huge city, actually. But we were going up some volcano. This was probably 8 or 10 years ago. The amount of trash along the trail, you could not find a square foot without some garbage there. So the idea, as American citizens, it's like, well, of course, litter is terrible. And we might see it from time to time. Some kids throw a 6-pack of beer out the window, so, you know, yeah, but it gets picked up. But in places like, you know, Indonesia and in parts of Africa, the amount of litter was just, and I'm sure that goes for the watershed and all those other.
Yeah, the crying Indian ad that you mentioned, you know, it's famous. I knew your career was in advertising, and It was the most successful public service ad
Probably ever.
in history. And it really points to the power of advertising and public relations in pushing cultural change. The Crying Indian ad didn't create the feeling that people were having. What it did was it crystallized the
Right.
feeling and made people act. And so it pushed the change along. Cultural change takes a long time. And a lot of the people who are pushing for cultural change, they labor in obscurity for many, many years before the breakthrough moment happens.
Right, a tipping point or something.
Yeah.
like that. Yeah.
And, let's hope that breakthrough moment happens in Indonesia pretty soon.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, it was stunning.
Yeah, no, I've had the same experience in Africa
Yeah.
and other places where it's like, this is a beautiful area and it's full of garbage.
Right.
Yeah. Thanks for your attention.
Well,
and
thank
for
you.
coming tonight.
Like I said, I love the book. I'm a little biased because I love the Adirondacks so much, but it's a great read. It's enjoyable, and yeah, I hope people will pick it up. And I'm looking forward to volume 2.
Yeah, well, if you ever want to know what it's really like to climb Mount Everest, I would recommend this one. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you both for coming, for being here. Buy the books. The link is online. It's downstairs as well. And I want to thank everyone for coming.
Great. Thank you.